Single dad left flowers at cemetery daily until the grave's billionaire sister found out. But when she followed him one morning, she uncovered a secret so heartbreaking, it made the woman with everything drop to her knees beside the man who'd lost it all. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning mist clung low to the ground at Willow Creek Cemetery, wrapping around weathered headstones like gentle fingers. The autumn air carried a sharp chill that made Jack Miller pull his worn denim jacket tighter around his shoulders. His work boots left clear prints in the dewy grass as he made his familiar journey through the rows of marble and granite. At 48, Jack's face carried the kind of lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. His graying temples caught the weak early morning light as he moved with practiced steps past the old oak tree, its leaves just beginning to turn golden. He knew this path by heart, could walk it blindfolded if he had to. But he didn't stop at Sarah's grave. Not yet. Instead, he continued 3 rows further to a polished black granite headstone that seemed to absorb the morning light. Michael Langford's name was etched in elegant script, along with the words beloved son and brother. The dates below showed a life cut short at 40 years. Jack knelt slowly, his knees protesting against the damp earth. From his jacket pocket, he withdrew a single daisy, its petals still perfect and white. He placed it carefully at the base of the stone, where it joined the browning remains of yesterday's flower. "Morning, Michael?" he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Another day, another chance to do better." He bowed his head, hands clasped loosely in his lap. The cemetery was silent except for the occasional call of early morning birds and the distant hum of traffic starting to build on Main Street. "Lord," Jack prayed, his eyes closed, "guide us all toward understanding. Help us find peace in your wisdom." His prayer was brief but heartfelt, the same words he'd spoken every morning for the past 6 years. The cemetery caretaker, Henry Webb, was trimming the hedge nearby. He nodded respectfully as Jack rose to his feet, but didn't speak. They'd developed an unspoken understanding over the years. Henry never mentioned Jack's daily visits to anyone, and Jack helped maintain some of the older headstones with his carpentry skills when needed. As Jack walked back to his truck, he passed Sarah's grave. The rose bush he'd planted there was thriving, just as she would have wanted. He touched the top of her headstone briefly, a gesture as natural as breathing, before continuing to his battered blue pickup. The dashboard clock read 6:45 a.m. when Jack pulled into the parking lot of Miller's workshop. The modest building sat at the edge of town, its weather-beaten sign promising quality craftsmanship and community service. Inside, the familiar scent of sawdust and wood stain greeted him as he flicked on the lights. The day passed in a blur of routine, guiding veterans through basic woodworking projects, reviewing plans for a community center renovation, and working on a delicate restoration of an antique rocking chair. By the time the autumn sun had begun to set, Jack's hands were covered in fine sawdust, and his back ached from bending over his workbench. The drive home took him past the high school where Sarah used to teach English. Emily had her mother's same classroom now, for her art classes. The thought brought a small smile to his tired face. When he pulled into the driveway of their modest 2-story house, the porch light was already on, and he could see Emily moving around in the kitchen through the window. At 15, she was becoming more like her mother every day. Same gentle spirit, same quiet strength. "Dad," Emily called out as he entered through the back door. She was setting the table, 2 plates of simple pasta waiting. "I made dinner. Well, I heated up Mrs. Patterson's lasagna, anyway." "Looks perfect, sweetheart." Jack hung his jacket by the door, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and sat down across from his daughter. They said grace together, their voices mixing in the familiar prayer. The kitchen was warm and homey, with its yellow walls and the collection of Emily's artwork pinned to the corkboard. Sarah's touches were still everywhere. The hand-painted tiles above the stove, the collection of teacups on the open shelving, the dried flowers hanging in the window. They ate quietly, sharing small details about their day. Emily talked about her art project, a watercolor series about hope and renewal. Jack listened, offering encouraging words between bites of lasagna. After dinner, while Emily worked on her homework at the kitchen table, Jack moved to the living room. He settled into his old armchair, his eyes drawn to the photograph on the side table. Sarah smiled back at him, caught mid-laugh at their last Christmas together. The silver frame had dulled slightly with age, but her joy remained as bright as ever. Jack picked up the frame, his thumb brushing across the glass. "I did what you'd want me to do," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. In the photo, Sarah's eyes seemed to sparkle with understanding, just as they always had in life. Through the doorway, he could hear Emily humming softly as she worked on her algebra, the same tune Sarah used to hum while grading papers. Some days, the echo of his wife and their daughter was almost too much to bear. Other days, like today, it felt like a blessing, a reminder that love never truly dies. It just changes form. Grace Langford stood at her bedroom window, gazing out over the manicured grounds of her estate. The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawn, but she barely noticed the beauty before her. The massive Georgian mansion felt emptier than usual. Today, its 14 rooms echoing with silence. Her silk robe whispered against the hardwood floors as she made her way downstairs to the kitchen. The space was all gleaming, stainless steel and marble countertops, designed by a famous interior decorator. But Grace only ever used the coffee maker. She reached for her favorite porcelain cup, the one Michael had given her for Christmas years ago. The phone rang, shattering the quiet. Grace glanced at the caller ID and frowned. Willow Creek Cemetery wasn't a number she expected to see. "Hello?" Her voice was composed, practiced from years of board meetings and charity galas. "Miss Langford?" The cemetery caretaker's gentle voice came through. "This is Henry Webb. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mr. Webb." Grace stirred her coffee absently. "Is there something wrong with the maintenance contract?" "No, ma'am. Everything's fine with that." There was a pause. "I just thought you should know. Someone's been leaving flowers on your brother's grave. Every morning, without fail." The spoon clattered against the marble countertop as Grace's hand jerked in surprise. "What kind of flowers?" "Daisies. Just one fresh daisy each day." Grace's free hand found the framed photo of Michael that sat on the kitchen counter. In it, he was grinning broadly, his arms slung around her shoulders at her 40th birthday party. It was taken just 3 months before the accident. "How long has this been happening?" Her voice had gone tight. 6 years, Miss Langford. Since... Henry trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. Grace's fingers tightened around the phone. 6 years? And you're just telling me now? I didn't want to upset you, ma'am. The gentleman who leaves them, he's respectful, quiet, never causes any trouble. But I thought maybe you'd want to know. What time? The word came out sharper than she intended. He comes early, usually around 6:30. Grace glanced at the clock. 6:15. Thank you, Mr. Webb. She ended the call before he could respond. 15 minutes later, Grace's Mercedes purred down the tree-lined drive that led to Willow Creek Cemetery. She'd thrown on a cashmere sweater and silk pants, her platinum watch catching the morning light as she gripped the steering wheel. The gates were already open, and she noticed a battered blue pickup truck parked near the entrance. She pulled her car into a secluded spot beneath an old oak tree, where she could see Michael's grave clearly. The black granite headstone stood out among the more modest markers surrounding it. The Langford family plot was set slightly apart, bordered by carefully maintained hedges, another sign of the wealth that had always separated them from the rest of the town. Grace stayed in her car, watching. The morning mist was beginning to lift when she saw him, a man in work clothes making his way through the graves. He moved with purpose, clearly knowing exactly where he was going. When he reached Michael's grave, he knelt down. Something twisted in Grace's chest as she watched him place a single daisy at the base of the headstone. The man's head bowed, and his lips moved in what appeared to be prayer. There was nothing threatening in his posture, nothing that suggested ill intent. But Grace felt her anger rising anyway. Who was he to intrude on their family's grief? What right did he have to this private pain? The man stayed there for several minutes, perfectly still in his reverence. When he finally stood, his movements were careful, respectful. He touched the top of the headstone briefly, a gesture that made Grace's breath catch before walking back toward the entrance. As he passed near her car, Grace got a better look at his face. He was middle-aged, with graying temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of both joy and sorrow. His clothes were worn but clean. Work boots, jeans, a denim jacket. Everything about him was modest, unremarkable. She watched him climb into the blue pickup truck and drive away. Only then did Grace step out of her car, her designer boots sinking slightly into the damp grass as she walked to Michael's grave. The daisy lay there, fresh and white against the dark stone. Next to it was yesterday's flower, its petals beginning to brown at the edges. Grace's hand trembled as she reached into her purse and pulled out the small framed photo she always carried. Michael at his college graduation, full of promise and dreams. She held it against her chest as she stared at the simple daisy. "Who is he, Michael?" she whispered. "What does he want?" The only answer was the rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. Grace stood there, torn between the urge to snatch up the flower and throw it away, and a strange, unwelcome curiosity about this man who had been paying his respects to her brother every single day for 6 years. Her fingers tightened around the frame as memories flooded back. Michael's laughter, his reckless charm, the way he could talk himself out of any trouble, the weight of her own guilt pressed down on her shoulders. She should have done more to stop him that night, should have taken his keys, called a cab, anything. The daisy seemed to mock her with its simple beauty. Here was someone who appeared to care deeply about Michael's memory, while she could barely bring herself to visit the grave more than a few times a year. The contrast between her designer clothes and expensive car and this stranger's humble offerings made her feel suddenly self-conscious. Grace's expression hardened as she looked down at the flower once more. Tomorrow, she decided, she would come back. She would find out who this man was and why he felt entitled to share in a grief that belonged to her family alone. The early morning mist clung to the cemetery grounds as Grace Langford's Mercedes pulled up to the wrought iron gates. Her fingers tightened around the leather steering wheel, knuckles turning white. Through the windshield, she spotted his familiar pickup truck, old, blue, with a carpenter's rack mounted on the back. She'd rehearsed this confrontation all night. How dare this stranger intrude on her family's private grief? What right did he have to visit Michael's grave day after day? Grace checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing her perfectly styled hair. Her designer coat felt like armor as she stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement with determined precision. There he was, the mysterious man with the daisies, kneeling before Michael's headstone. Even from behind, she could see his broad shoulders beneath his worn work jacket. A tool belt hung from his waist, suggesting he was on his way to a job site. "Excuse me," Grace called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the morning stillness. "I believe we need to talk." The man turned slowly, rising to his feet with careful movements. His face was kind but weathered, like someone who spent long hours working outdoors. Those gentle eyes caught her off guard. They held none of the defensiveness she'd expected. "You've been leaving flowers on my brother's grave," Grace continued, forcing steel back into her voice. "Every single day. Why? Did you know Michael?" "Yes, ma'am," he answered quietly. "My name is Jack Miller." He held the daisy in his work-roughened hands with such care it made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Well, Mr. Miller, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this needs to stop. My brother's death is a private matter. Our family's grief isn't some tourist attraction." Jack's expression remained steady, patient. "Mrs. Langford, I understand how this must look to you, but I'm not here to intrude. I come to pray for Michael and for my Sarah." "Sarah?" The name hung in the air between them. "My wife." Jack's voice softened. She was driving home from the hospital that night. Her shift as a nurse had just ended. When Michael's car. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When the accident happened, they both died instantly." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Her hand reached out to steady herself against a nearby headstone. You're that carpenter. The one whose wife." The newspaper headlines from 3 years ago flashed through her mind. "Drunk driving claims 2 lives." "Yes, ma'am." Jack's eyes held no accusation, no bitterness. "I come here every morning to leave a daisy. Sarah loved them, grew them in our garden, and I pray for both of them." "But why?" Grace's voice cracked. "My brother, he was drunk. He caused the accident that killed your wife. How can you possibly—" "Because holding on to anger only hurts ourselves," Jack said simply. Sarah believed that. She spent her life helping others, showing grace to people who didn't deserve it. Forgiving your brother, it's what she would have wanted. Grace's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. She thought of all the times she'd enabled Michael's behavior, writing checks to cover his mistakes, making excuses for his actions. "I failed him," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I should have been stronger, should have forced him to get help." "We all carry regrets, Mrs. Langford, but guilt won't bring them back." A sob caught in her throat. Here was this man, this stranger who had every right to hate her family, showing more grace than she'd ever managed to find for herself. "I should go," Grace managed, turning quickly toward her car. She couldn't bear the kindness in his eyes, the weight of his forgiveness. The drive home passed in a blur. Grace barely registered the massive gates of her estate swinging open, or the concerned look from her housekeeper as she rushed inside. She made it to her study before the tears finally came. Hours later, as night settled over the mansion, Grace sat in her brother's old room. Nothing had been touched since his death. The sports trophies still lined the shelves, photos of his bright smile frozen in time. Her phone glowed in the darkness as she pulled up their last text exchange. Michael, I'll change, sis, I promise. Grace, you better mean it this time. Michael, I do. Meeting's at 7. Don't worry so much. He never made it to that AA meeting. Instead, his car swerved across the center line at 6:45 p.m., taking not only his life, but that of an innocent nurse, a wife, who had spent her day caring for others only to never make it home. And now her widowed husband came to pray at Michael's grave every morning, carrying daisies and forgiveness that Grace had never learned to give, not to Michael, and certainly not to herself. Jack Miller's words echoed in her mind. Holding on to anger only hurts ourselves. Grace closed her eyes, remembering the quiet strength in his voice, the grace in his actions that she'd never managed to find despite all her wealth and privilege. She looked down at her phone again, at Michael's last promise to change. Her fingers traced over the words until the screen went dark, leaving her alone with thoughts of daisies, forgiveness, and the humble carpenter who seemed to understand both. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Miller's community workshop, casting long shadows across the sawdust-covered floor. Jack Miller stood at his workbench, carefully examining the books spread before him. Red ink marked nearly every page, telling a story he didn't want to read. Let's see, he muttered, running his finger down another column of numbers. Electric bill, lumber costs, insurance. His voice trailed off as he jotted figures on a worn notepad. The workshop's main room was modest but welcoming, with 6 workstations equipped with basic tools. Photos of completed projects lined the walls, chairs, tables, and cabinets, each with smiling faces standing proudly beside them. The smell of fresh wood shavings mixed with coffee from the small kitchen area where Emily helped out after school. The front door creaked open, and Tommy, a former Marine with a prosthetic leg, limped in. "Morning, Mr. Miller," he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet space. Jack quickly tucked the bills into a drawer. "Tommy, right on time. Ready to start that rocking chair today?" "Yes, sir. Been thinking about it all week." Tommy's eyes lit up as he moved toward his workstation. Jack had seen that look before, the spark of purpose returning to tired eyes. As Jack helped Tommy select the right pieces of oak, the door opened again. This time it was Marcus, an ex-convict who'd been coming to the workshop for 3 months. His tattooed hands were already reaching for his half-finished bookshelf before he'd even said hello. "Mr. M." Marcus nodded. "Brought those sandpaper sheets you asked for." "Thanks, Marcus. Just put them by the supply cabinet." "How's the job search going?" "Got an interview at the furniture store? Tomorrow." Marcus smiled sheepishly. "Think I might actually have a shot, thanks to what you've taught me." Jack patted him on the shoulder, his heart warming despite the morning's worries. This was why he kept the workshop running. Moments like these meant more than money in the bank. The morning progressed with the steady rhythm of work, the whir of sanders, the careful measuring of wood, and Jack's patient instruction. He moved from station to station, offering guidance here, encouragement there. When Tommy struggled with his chair's armrest, Jack spent extra time showing him how to compensate for his limited mobility. Around noon, Emily arrived from school, carrying her backpack and a brown paper bag. "Dad, I brought you lunch," she called out, making her way through the workshop. She set up at her usual spot near the kitchen area, pulling out sandwiches she'd made that morning. As Jack took a break to eat with his daughter, the mail carrier dropped off another stack of envelopes. Emily watched her father's face tighten as he sorted through them. "More bills?" she asked quietly, pushing half her sandwich toward him. Jack forced a smile. "Nothing to worry about, sweetheart. God's gotten us this far, hasn't he?" Emily nodded, but her eyes lingered on the envelopes. "Maybe we could charge a little something? Just for materials?" Jack shook his head. "These men need a chance more than I need money. Remember what Mom used to say about giving? It's not about what you have, it's about what you share," Emily quoted softly, managing a small smile. The afternoon brought more students, 2 more veterans, another ex-convict, and a young man fresh out of rehab. Jack worked with each one, teaching them not just about woodworking, but about patience, precision, and pride in honest work. As the sun began to set, casting orange light through the western windows, the workshop's door opened once more. Grace Langford stood in the doorway, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed out of place among the sawdust and tools. Nobody noticed her at first, They were all focused on their work. Jack was helping Tommy with his rocking chair, demonstrating how to shape the curved runners. "See, you want to follow the grain of the wood," he explained, guiding Tommy's hands. "Let the wood tell you where it wants to go." Grace watched silently from the entrance. Tommy's face was screwed up in concentration as he worked the wood, his prosthetic leg propped carefully for balance. Jack stood beside him, patient and encouraging, looking nothing like the broken man she'd confronted at the cemetery. "That's it," Jack said warmly as Tommy completed the curve. "You've got a natural feel for this. Never thought I'd be able to make something like this," Tommy admitted, running his hand along the smooth wood, especially not after. He glanced down at his prosthetic leg. "The body adapts," Jack said gently, "and so does the spirit. This chair's going to be beautiful, Tommy. Your daughter's going to love rocking your grandbaby in it someday." Grace moved quietly toward the donation box near the entrance. It was a simple wooden box, beautifully crafted with the words, "Give what you can, take what you need," carved into its lid. She opened her purse, removed her checkbook, and wrote quickly but deliberately. As she slipped the check into the box, she took one last look around the workshop. Jack was still working with Tommy, while Marcus helped another veteran with measurements. Emily sat at her homework station, occasionally glancing at her father with obvious pride. Grace slipped out as quietly as she had entered, the door closing softly behind her. Inside the donation box, her check lay folded, the amount substantial enough to cover several months of bills. The morning light streamed through the workshop's windows as Jack Miller sorted through the day's mail. Bills, advertisements, and a plain white envelope caught his attention. No return address, just Miller's Community Workshop, written in elegant script. Inside, he found a check that made his eyes widen. $5,000? He whispered, studying the signature line that read only "a friend." His weathered hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. The amount would cover the overdue electric bill and enough lumber to keep the workshop running for months. Emily peered over his shoulder, her dark hair falling forward. "Who's it from, Dad?" "Someone kind," Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Someone very kind." That afternoon, Jack deposited the check at Willow Creek's small community bank. The teller, Mrs. Henderson, assured him it was legitimate. "Drawn on Virginia First National," she said with a smile. "It's good as gold, Jack." Back at the workshop, Jack gathered his small group of regulars, 3 veterans and 2 men recently released from prison. "Looks like we can start that wheelchair ramp project for the senior center after all," he announced, watching their faces light up. Tom, a former Marine with a prosthetic leg, grinned. "About time we put these hands to good use again." The following Tuesday, another envelope appeared. This time, it contained enough to stock their small kitchen for the weekly community meals they'd had to suspend. Emily immediately started planning the menu, her enthusiasm infectious as she wrote up a shopping list. "We could make Mom's lasagna recipe," she suggested, her eyes bright. "Remember how she always made extra for anyone who needed it?" Jack wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "That's perfect, sweetheart." Week after week, the envelopes continued arriving. Sometimes they held checks for specific amounts, exactly what was needed for new tools or materials. Other times, grocery store gift cards appeared, as if their anonymous benefactor knew precisely when supplies ran low. The workshop came alive again. The sound of saws and hammers filled the air, accompanied by laughter and conversation. Jack noticed how his students stood taller, worked with renewed purpose. They built furniture for local shelters, repaired porches for elderly neighbors, and crafted toys for children's homes. Emily flourished in her role as the workshop's heart, organizing the community meals with growing confidence. She set up long tables in the parking lot every Thursday evening, covering them with checkered tablecloths and mason jars filled with wildflowers. The aroma of home-cooked meals drew people from all walks of life: veterans, families, lonely seniors, and anyone needing a hot meal and warm company. One particularly beautiful evening in late spring, Emily arranged the outdoor tables while Jack and his crew finished up their day's work. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, casting a warm glow over the gathering crowd. "The lasagna's ready," Emily called out, carrying a steaming pan. Tom hurried to help her, while others brought out salads, garlic bread, and pitchers of sweet tea. Children played tag between the tables, their laughter mixing with the murmur of conversation. Just across the street, Grace Langford sat in her silver Mercedes, watching the scene unfold. She'd taken to driving by the workshop regularly, always keeping her distance, but unable to stay away completely. Through her open window, she could hear the sounds of fellowship and joy. A young boy with tattered shoes received a heaping plate of food from Emily, who then gave him a gentle hug. Jack appeared beside them, ruffling the boy's hair and adding an extra piece of garlic bread to his plate. The simple gesture of kindness brought unexpected tears to Grace's eyes. "This is what Michael needed," she whispered to herself, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Not my money or excuses, just this kind of love." She watched as Jack moved among the tables, stopping to chat with each person, his hand resting supportively on shoulders, his smile genuine and warm. Emily flitted between groups like a bright butterfly, making sure everyone had enough to eat. Her father's same compassionate spirit evident in her every action. The workshop's worn building glowed with warmth from within, its windows reflecting the sunset. Where Grace had once seen only a struggling business, she now witnessed a sanctuary of hope. Her brother's death had left her with wealth and guilt, but watching this scene, she finally felt her money doing what money should, helping create moments of dignity and connection. "Maybe this is how I can make amends," Grace whispered, her voice catching slightly. She gripped her steering wheel, fighting the urge to join them. Not yet. For now, she was content to witness the ripples of kindness spreading from her anonymous gifts, transforming not just the workshop, but the entire community. As the evening light faded into dusk, the gathering showed no signs of dispersing. Someone had brought out a guitar, and music floated on the warm air. Grace watched Jack and Emily share a quick hug between serving dessert, their faces glowing with simple joy. In their smiles, she saw healing. Not just their own, but a healing that reached out to embrace everyone present. Through her windshield, Grace observed this tapestry of community she'd helped weave from afar. Her brother's reckless choices had torn lives apart, including his own. But here, in this humble parking lot turned gathering place, she glimpsed something beautiful emerging from those broken pieces. Every envelope she'd sent felt like a stitch, helping to mend what had been broken. As the music played and people continued to share food and friendship under the emerging stars, Grace remained in her car, a quiet witness to the power of anonymous kindness. Her eyes misted with joy as she whispered, "Maybe this is how I can make amends." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the workshop's wooden floor as Grace Langford stood at her car, gathering courage. In her hands, she held 2 large casserole dishes filled with homemade lasagna. The savory aroma wafted through the air, mingling with the scent of freshly cut wood. Through the open doors, she could see Jack teaching a young veteran how to sand a table edge. His patient movements and gentle instruction reminded her of how her father used to teach Michael. The memory made her chest tighten, but she forced herself to move forward. Emily spotted her first. "Dad, look who's here." The teenager's eyes lit up as she rushed to help Grace with the dishes. "Is that lasagna? It smells amazing." Jack looked up, surprise flickering across his face before settling into a warm smile. "Miss Langford," he said, setting down his tools and wiping his hands on his work apron. "Welcome to our humble workshop. Please, call me Grace," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I thought, well, I heard you host community dinners sometimes. I wanted to contribute." The workshop buzzed with activity. As volunteers gathered around the long table Jack had built specifically for these meals. Some faces showed curiosity at the well-dressed visitor, while others focused on setting up paper plates and plastic utensils with quiet efficiency. "Here, let me help you set up," Jack offered, clearing a space on the table. His calloused hands moved with the same care he showed his woodwork. "We usually eat outside when weather permits, but there's a chill in the air today." Grace watched as Emily orchestrated the dinner preparation, directing veterans and former inmates with natural ease. "Your daughter has quite the leadership skills," she observed. Jack's pride was evident in his smile. "She gets that from her mother." Sarah could organize anything with a smile that made everyone want to help. The mention of Sarah's name hung in the air between them, but instead of the usual weight of grief, it felt like a gentle acknowledgement of shared understanding. As the group settled around the table, Grace found herself seated between Jack and an older veteran named Tom, who wore his cap indoors and had hands that shook slightly when he reached for his drink. "Ma'am," Tom said, nodding respectfully, "this is mighty fine of you. We don't often get cooking like this." "Usually, it's Dad's chili," Emily chimed in from across the table, her eyes twinkling. "And trust me, that's something to be grateful for when we get anything else." Laughter rippled around the table, and Grace felt something inside her relax. Here, her designer clothes and family name meant nothing. She was just someone sharing a meal. As they ate, stories flowed as freely as the lemonade Emily kept pouring. Tom spoke about learning to work with wood despite his trembling hands. A younger man with tattoos peeking from under his sleeves shared his pride in completing his first solo project, a toy box for his daughter. Jack here, Tom said, gesturing with his fork. He tells us it's not about being perfect. It's about learning to work with what we've got, flaws and all. Grace caught Jack's eye. That's quite profound. Jack shrugged modestly. Life rarely gives us perfect materials to work with. Sometimes the boards are warped, sometimes they're knotted. But there's beauty in learning to work with what we have. And forgiveness? Grace asked quietly. How did you learn that? The conversation around them continued, but Grace felt as if she and Jack were in their own bubble of understanding. It wasn't easy, Jack admitted, his voice low. Some days it still isn't, but holding on to anger, it's like carrying around a piece of wood that's too heavy. Eventually, you have to set it down or it'll break you. Grace stared at her plate, pushing the remaining food around with her fork. I haven't forgiven myself, she whispered. For Michael. For all the times I could have stopped him, should have been stronger. Grace. Jack's voice was gentle but firm. We can't change the grain of the wood. Once it's cut, we can only decide what to make with what remains. Tears threatened to spill, but Grace blinked them back. Around them, the workshop hummed with life and purpose, the very things she'd been seeking in her endless charity galas and foundation meetings. As the evening wound down and volunteers began clearing away plates, Grace gathered her empty dishes. I should go, she said, though part of her wanted to stay in this warm, honest space. Jack walked her to her car, Emily trailing behind them. The workshop lights spilled out onto the gravel parking lot, creating long shadows that stretched into the gathering dusk. Wait! Emily called out just as Grace was about to get into her car. The girl darted away and returned moments later, something clutched in her hand. Here, she said, holding out a single daisy. Dad says daisies mean second chances. Grace took the flower, its white petals luminous in the fading light. Her vision blurred as she carefully laid it on the passenger seat. Thank you, Emily. Thank you both. As she drove away, Grace caught a glimpse of father and daughter in her rearview mirror, standing in the warm light of the workshop. For the first time in years, her smile came easily, even through her tears. The morning sun filtered through Grace's office window, casting a warm glow on her mahogany desk. She sifted through her mail, her fingers pausing on a plain white envelope with no return address. Something about its simplicity made her stomach tighten. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper and several grainy photographs. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the letter, typed in stark black letters. Miss Langford, as a concerned citizen, I feel compelled to warn you about Jack Miller's workshop scam. He's been collecting anonymous donations and using them for personal gain. The attached photos show him pocketing envelopes from wealthy donors. Don't let yourself be fooled like others before you. Grace's throat went dry as she spread the photos across her desk. There was Jack, captured in shadowy images, collecting envelopes from various locations around town. In one photo, he stood by his truck, counting what appeared to be cash. Another showed him entering a bank, an envelope clutched in his hand. She pressed her fingers to her temples, feeling the familiar weight of disappointment settling in. Memories flooded back, the countless times people had tried to exploit the Langford name after Michael's death. The fake charities claiming to honor his memory, the supposed friends who only wanted a piece of the family fortune. I should have known better, she whispered, picking up a framed photo of Michael from her desk. Her brother's smiling face stared back at her, forever frozen in time. People don't change, do they? Grace pulled out her laptop and began reviewing the workshop's financial records. The numbers seemed clean enough, but hadn't the best con artists always kept perfect books, she thought, of Jack's gentle demeanor, his daily visits to Michael's grave, the way he mentored troubled souls in his workshop. Had it all been an act? Her phone buzzed. A text from Jack thanking her for yesterday's dinner and inviting her to join them for the workshop's weekly community gathering. She left it unanswered, her finger hovering over the delete button. Standing at her window, Grace watched the gardener tend to her immaculate rose garden. How many times had she built walls around herself, only to let them down and get hurt again? After Michael's death, vultures had circled endlessly, each with their own agenda, their own way of trying to profit from her grief. She thought of Emily's innocent smile when she'd handed her that daisy. Second chances, the girl had said. But second chances were luxury items that cost too much. Grace had learned that lesson the hard way. Opening her safe, she pulled out the folder containing the workshop's funding documents. Each check she'd written, each donation she'd planned, all of it based on a trust that now felt foolish. Her pen hovered over the cancellation forms, hesitating for just a moment. "I'm sorry, Emily," she murmured, signing her name with practiced efficiency. The letters would go out tomorrow, citing restructuring of charitable giving as the reason. Clean, professional, final. That afternoon, Grace drove past the cemetery but didn't stop. Through her tinted windows, she glimpsed Jack's familiar figure by Michael's grave, daisy in hand. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she accelerated past, leaving only dust in her wake. Back in her office, she instructed her secretary to forward all calls from Jack Miller to voicemail. The workshop's number was added to a polite but firm "do not accept" list. It was easier this way, cleaner, like cauterizing a wound before it could fester. As twilight settled over the town, Jack stood in his workshop, staring at the empty donation box. The space where Grace's envelopes usually appeared was stark and bare. He ran a calloused hand through his graying hair, confusion etched in the lines around his eyes. "Everything okay, Dad?" Emily asked from the doorway, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Yeah, sweetheart," he replied, his voice tired but steady. "Just trying to figure out how we'll manage next month's supplies." The workshop felt colder somehow, the walls seeming to close in around the half-finished projects and worn tools. Jack's gaze drifted to the window, where the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of fading hope. In her mansion on the hill, Grace sat alone in her study, the anonymous letter crumpled in her wastebasket. She poured herself a glass of wine, trying to convince herself she'd done the right thing, the smart thing, the safe thing. Outside her window, a single daisy swayed in the evening breeze, unnoticed and alone. The workshop felt emptier with each passing day. Jack stood at his workbench, running his calloused hands over a half-finished rocking chair. Sawdust danced in the morning light streaming through the windows, but the usual warmth was missing. The silence hung heavy, where laughter and the buzz of activity once filled the air. "Maybe they'll come tomorrow," he muttered, though deep down he knew better. 3 of his regular volunteers hadn't shown up this week. The donation box sat empty, its metal bottom visible through the slot, a stark reminder of their situation. Emily walked in, her school backpack slung over one shoulder. "Dad? I made some sandwiches for lunch." She placed a paper bag on his workbench, her eyes scanning the empty workshop. "Thanks, sweetheart." Jack managed to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "How was school?" "It was okay." Emily hesitated, then added, "Where's everyone? And have you seen Miss Langford lately?" Jack's hands stilled on the wood. "Sometimes people need to move on, Em. We can't expect them to stay forever." The bills were stacked neatly in his office, overdue notices for electricity, supplies, and the workshop's rent. Jack had been stretching his personal savings, but they both knew it wouldn't last long. That afternoon, Pete, one of his most dedicated veterans, came by to return his tools. "I'm sorry, Jack," he said, eyes downcast. "Gotta find paid work. My wife. Well, you understand." Jack clasped Pete's shoulder. "You don't need to explain. You've come so far, Pete. I'm proud of you." After Pete left, Jack sat alone in his office, staring at the wall where photographs hung. Smiling faces of men and women who'd found purpose in his workshop. Some had gone on to start their own businesses, others had reconnected with estranged families. Each success story felt like a gift from Sarah. The sun was setting when Jack locked up the workshop. He drove to Willow Creek Cemetery, following the familiar path between the headstones. Michael Langford's grave stood silent in the fading light. Jack knelt, placing his daily daisy, but his eyes drifted to the empty space where Grace's fresh flowers usually lay. "I don't understand," he whispered, more to himself than to the grave. "Did I do something wrong?" The evening air grew chilly as Jack walked back to his truck. He passed the cemetery caretaker, Henry, who was closing the gates. "Evening, Jack," Henry called out softly. "Haven't seen Miss Langford in a while." Jack nodded, his throat tight. "No, you wouldn't have." At home, Emily was setting the table for dinner. 2 plates where there had often been more lately. The workshop's volunteers had become regular guests at their table, bringing life and stories to their modest home. Now the silence felt deafening. "Dad?" Emily's voice was small. "Are we going to have to close the workshop?" Jack pulled her into a hug, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. "God has a plan, sweetheart. We just have to trust it." Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Jack sat in his favorite chair, holding Sarah's photograph. "I thought I was doing what you would have wanted," he whispered, "helping others heal, finding purpose in the pain." His voice cracked, but maybe I was wrong. Across town, in her sprawling mansion, Grace sat in her study, the anonymous letter spread out before her. The photograph showed Jack collecting envelopes from the donation box, his expression unreadable in the grainy images. She'd spent days analyzing every pixel, every shadow, looking for proof of what? Deceit? Greed? The guilt gnawed at her insides. She thought of Emily's smile when she'd handed her that daisy, of Jack's quiet strength as he taught broken men to build beautiful things, of the peace she'd felt watching them all share meals together. Unable to sleep, Grace drove to the cemetery. The gates were locked, but she had a key. One of the privileges of being a major benefactor. The moon cast long shadows as she made her way to Michael's grave. The single daisy Jack had left that morning lay pristine against the marble. Grace touched its petals, remembering Emily's words. "Dad says daisies mean second chances. Did I misjudge him again?" she whispered to her brother's grave. The words hung in the night air, unanswered. She thought of Michael, of all the times she'd defended him against accusations that turned out to be true. Now, was she doing the opposite, condemning an innocent man because she was too afraid to trust? The wind rustled through the willow trees, carrying with it memories of laughter from the workshop, of prayers whispered over fresh-baked bread, of healing found in the simple act of creating something beautiful. Grace hugged herself in the darkness, feeling more alone than she had in years. Back at Jack's house, Emily lay awake, listening to her father's footsteps in the hallway, his nightly ritual of checking on her, then spending time in prayer. She clutched her own small photograph of her mother, wondering if somehow, Sarah was watching over them still. The workshop stood silent in the moonlight, its windows dark. Inside, half-finished projects waited on workbenches, a jewelry box Pete had been making for his daughter, a hope chest another volunteer had started for his sister's wedding, the rocking chair Jack had been crafting with such care. Each piece told a story of redemption, of second chances, of faith in something larger than oneself. But tonight, those stories hung in limbo, their endings uncertain, while two hearts ached with the weight of trust broken and hope deferred. Emily stood frozen in the workshop doorway, her heart sinking as she heard her father's muffled voice through the office door. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but his worried tone made her pause. "I understand, Mr. Thompson. Yes, I'll have the final decision by Friday." Her father's voice cracked slightly. "The bills?" "Yes, I know they're overdue. I just need a little more time to figure things out." Emily pressed her back against the wall, her throat tight. Through the dusty window, she watched two empty chairs where veterans usually worked, learning to sand and shape wood into beautiful pieces. Now they sat abandoned, tools scattered nearby like forgotten promises. Maybe it's time to face reality. She heard her father say, "Closing the workshop might be our only option." Those words hit Emily like a physical blow. The workshop wasn't just a building, it was where broken people came to heal, where her father's gentle guidance helped others rebuild their lives, piece by piece, just as he'd rebuild his own after Mom died. She thought of Grace, who hadn't visited in weeks. The mysterious envelopes had stopped appearing, and with them, the hope that had brightened her father's eyes. Emily knew in her heart that Grace needed to hear the truth. Without hesitation, she grabbed her backpack and rushed to her bike, leaning against the workshop wall. The morning air was crisp as she pedaled through town, past the familiar streets, and toward the wealthy hillside where the Langford estate stood like a fortress. The iron gates loomed before her, intricate and imposing. Two security guards watched as she approached, out of breath and determined. "I need to see Miss Langford," Emily announced, trying to keep her voice steady. "Please, it's important." The guards exchanged glances. "Miss Langford isn't receiving visitors," one said firmly. Emily pulled out her notebook and a pen with trembling fingers. "Then please, just give her this note. It's about my dad, Jack Miller, and her brother, Michael." She wrote quickly, pouring her heart onto the page. "Dear Miss Grace, you don't know the whole story. Every morning before dawn, Dad picks a daisy from Mom's garden, the one she planted before she died. He takes it to Michael's grave because he believes everyone deserves forgiveness and peace. He prays for Michael's soul just as much as he prays for Mom's. The workshop isn't about money. It's about helping people heal, just like Dad had to heal after losing Mom. He says broken things can become beautiful again if you give them a chance. Please come see for yourself." She folded the note carefully and handed it to the kinder-looking guard. Please, make sure she gets this. It's really important." The guard hesitated, then nodded. "Wait here." Minutes stretched like hours as Emily stood by her bike, watching clouds drift across the morning sky. Finally, the guard returned and spoke quietly into his radio. The massive gates creaked open. "Miss Langford will see you," he said. Emily was led through manicured gardens to a sunroom where Grace sat, still elegant but somehow smaller than Emily remembered. The note lay open in her trembling hands. "Is this true?" Grace asked softly, holding up the paper. "About the daisies? About the prayers?" Emily nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "Dad says forgiveness isn't something you do once, it's something you choose every day. That's why he goes every morning, rain or shine." Grace's composed facade cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she read the note again. "I've been so foolish," she whispered, "so quick to believe the worst when someone showed me kindness." She looked up at Emily, her eyes filled with pain and regret. "What have I done?" Emily watched as Grace covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a gentle light on this broken moment. A moment that felt like the first crack in a wall that had stood for far too long. The morning mist clung to the headstones like a delicate veil, transforming Willow Creek Cemetery into an ethereal landscape that seemed caught between earth and heaven. Grace Langford pulled her cashmere sweater tighter around her shoulders as she drove through the wrought iron gates, her Mercedes gliding silently along the gravel path. The dashboard clock read 6:45 a.m. She knew Jack's routine by now, had memorized it during all those mornings when she'd watched from her window, trying to understand the man who'd turned her world upside down with his quiet compassion. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, and she flexed her fingers to stop the shaking. Emily's note, folded carefully in her pocket, felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The girl's earnest handwriting had kept her awake all night. Every word burned into her memory. "My dad uses daisies from Mom's garden. He says they're special because they mean hope can grow anywhere, even in the darkest places. Mom planted them before she died, and Dad tends them every morning before he goes to your brother's grave." Grace had read those words dozens of times, each reading revealing another layer of meaning she'd been too proud to see before. The daisies weren't just flowers. They were Sarah Miller's legacy, carefully tended by the husband she'd left behind, transformed into gifts of forgiveness for the man who'd taken her life. Grace parked her car at a distance, not wanting to draw attention or disturb the sacred ritual she'd come to witness. The morning dew soaked through her expensive leather shoes as she walked across the wet grass, but she barely noticed the cold seeping through the Italian leather. Her eyes were fixed on the familiar figure kneeling before her brother's grave, his silhouette outlined against the pale morning sky. Jack Miller's shoulders were hunched with exhaustion, his work jacket showing signs of wear she hadn't noticed before, frayed cuffs, a small tear near the elbow that had been carefully mended with thread that didn't quite match. His whispered prayers carried faintly on the morning breeze, too soft for her to make out the words, but the rhythm was familiar now, like a song she'd heard countless times without truly listening. A single daisy, pristine and white with a golden center that caught the early light, lay on the morning wet grass, beside him, waiting to be placed. Grace could see the care with which it had been chosen. The perfect stem, the unblemished petals that must have been selected from among dozens in Sarah's garden. When Jack finally rose, Grace expected him to perform his usual ritual, placing the flower with gentle reverence, saying a final prayer before walking away. Instead, he just stood there, swaying slightly on his feet, the daisy still on the ground. His exhaustion was visible in every line of his body, in the way his shoulders sagged and his head hung low. The weight of carrying forgiveness for so long, of rebuilding his life while helping others rebuild theirs, had finally taken its toll. After a long moment that stretched like an eternity, he turned and walked away, leaving the flower behind like a prayer left unfinished. Grace's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't name. This wasn't the confident, peaceful man she'd come to know and admire. This wasn't the Jack who'd stood tall in his workshop, teaching broken men how to build beautiful things with their hands. This was someone carrying a heavy burden, a burden she had helped create with her suspicion, her pride, and her inability to trust in the goodness she'd seen with her own eyes. She waited until he was some distance away before following, keeping to the tree line that bordered the cemetery. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she moved from shadow to shadow, feeling like a spy in her own story of redemption. Jack's pickup truck remained in its spot near the main entrance, which meant he was walking to the workshop as he always did. But his pace was different now, slow, almost shuffling, so different from his usual purposeful stride that spoke of a man who knew exactly where he was going and why. The workshop was only a few blocks from the cemetery, a walk Jack had made thousands of times over the years. But today, the distance felt endless as Grace trailed behind him, watching the way his head hung low, the way he seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. She thought of Emily's words again about hope growing anywhere and wondered if Jack's hope was finally running out. The House of Second Chances sign above the workshop door was slightly crooked now, hanging at an angle that made the whole building look tired. The windows were dark, no warm glow of early morning activity spilling onto the sidewalk. No smell of coffee brewing drifted from the open door. No sound of early morning conversation from the veterans who used to gather there before starting their day's work. The parking lot that used to be full of beat-up trucks and motorcycles stood empty, except for a few scattered leaves blown in by the morning wind. Jack paused at the entrance, his hand resting on the handle for a long moment, as if gathering the strength to face what waited inside. Grace held her breath, watching from across the street as he finally pushed open the door and disappeared into the darkness beyond. Through the window, Grace watched him move through the dimly lit space like a ghost haunting his own dreams. He ran his hand along a half-finished table, its surface smooth from hours of careful sanding. His fingers traced the joinery work on a bookshelf that would never find a home, lingering on the craftsmanship that had been poured into every joint and corner. The workshop that had once buzzed with life and purpose, with the sound of hammers and saws, with laughter and conversation, with the quiet satisfaction of men learning to build their lives anew, now felt like a museum of broken dreams. Grace's eyes burned with unshed tears as she watched Jack move through his sanctuary like a man saying goodbye. This place had been his life's work, his tribute to Sarah's memory, his way of honoring the belief that everyone deserved a second chance. And she had helped destroy it with her doubt, her inability to trust in the miracle of forgiveness she'd witnessed every morning in the cemetery. Unable to watch any longer, Grace retraced her steps to the cemetery, her expensive shoes slipping on the wet grass. The morning had grown brighter, the sun climbing higher above the tree line, but the mist still lingered among the headstones like the ghosts of dreams deferred. Her brother's grave looked exactly as it always did, the simple granite headstone with its stark inscription, the carefully maintained grass, the stone border that had been installed at great expense but had never been warmed by the simple gift of flowers. Except for the lonely daisy still lying in the grass where Jack had left it. Grace knelt down slowly, her knees pressing into the damp earth, and picked up the flower with trembling fingers. Its petals were perfect, probably chosen carefully from Sarah's garden that morning while the dew still clung to the leaves. How many mornings had he done this? How many daisies had he brought, each one a symbol of forgiveness, freely given to a man who could never thank him for it? She thought of Emily's letter again, of the girl's simple explanation that had cut through all of Grace's complicated defenses. Jack hadn't been performing some elaborate show of piety or angling for her money. He had simply been doing what Sarah would have wanted, choosing love over hate, forgiveness over bitterness, hope over despair. Her fingers trembled as she placed the flower against Michael's headstone, the white petals stark against the gray granite. "I'm sorry," she whispered, touching the cold marble that had never been warmed by such a simple gesture. "I'm so sorry, Michael, for everything, for enabling you when I should have helped you face your demons, for giving you money instead of boundaries, for not understanding what real forgiveness looks like until Jack showed me." The tears came freely now, falling onto the petals of the daisy like morning dew. Grace didn't try to wipe them away or compose herself. For the first time since Michael's death, she let herself feel the full weight of her guilt, her grief, and her growing understanding of what true grace meant. Not the kind that came with conditions and expectations, but the kind that Jack had shown her, unearned, undeserved, and freely given. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Emily's note, unfolding it with careful fingers and reading it one more time. "Dad says daisies mean hope can grow anywhere, even in the darkest places. He says Mom knew that when she planted them, and that's why he brings them to your brother, because even someone who makes terrible mistakes deserves to have hope growing on their grave." Grace looked at the single flower, this simple thing that had somehow become a symbol of everything she needed to learn about love, loss, and the courage to begin again. She thought of Jack's words from that first morning when she'd confronted him, that he prayed for both Michael and Sarah, that forgiveness was a choice you made every day, that hope was something you planted and tended like a garden. Standing slowly, Grace brushed the grass from her knees and looked around the cemetery with new eyes. The morning sun had finally burned through the mist, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds and illuminating the headstones like beacons of memory. She took one last look at the daisy, her first offering of forgiveness, resting against her brother's headstone. In all the years since Michael's death, she had never brought flowers, too caught up in her own pain and guilt to perform such a simple act of love. She understood now what Jack had been trying to teach her all along, what Emily had expressed so simply in her note. Forgiveness wasn't about deserving it. It wasn't about earning your way back into grace or proving you'd changed enough to merit another chance. It was about choosing love anyway, planting hope anyway, believing in redemption anyway. It was about learning that grace, real grace, was something you gave, not something you earned. Jack Miller stood in his modest kitchen, frowning at the recipe card in his hands. Flour dusted his work clothes, and a smudge of cocoa powder marked his cheek. The countertop was a mess of measuring cups, spilled sugar, and half-empty boxes of baking supplies. "Dad, you really don't have to do this," Emily said from the doorway, her kind eyes watching him struggle with the cake batter. "I told you, I'm fine with just us having dinner together." Jack looked up, managing a smile despite his frustration. "Your mother never missed baking you a birthday cake, sweetheart. 15 is special." He paused, whisking the lumpy mixture with determination. "I may not be able to afford much this year, but I can at least do this." Emily walked over and hugged him from behind, resting her head against his shoulder. "Mom would be laughing right now, you know. Remember when she tried teaching you to make cookies that Christmas? And I set off the smoke alarm?" Jack chuckled, the sound warming the kitchen. "Twice." The afternoon sun filtered through the window, casting long shadows across their small dining room. Jack had decorated it with paper streamers from the dollar store, and a hand-painted Happy Birthday Emily banner hung crookedly on the wall. 3 mismatched chairs surrounded their old wooden table. The 4th had broken months ago, and they hadn't been able to replace it. While the cake baked, filling the house with the sweet scent of chocolate, Emily helped her father clean up. They worked in comfortable silence, both lost in thoughts of birthdays past when Sarah's laughter had filled these rooms. The cake came out slightly lopsided but edible. Jack was spreading the last of the frosting, trying to hide a particularly obvious dip in the middle when the doorbell rang. Emily rushed to answer it, leaving Jack to hastily wipe his hands on a dish towel. He heard his daughter's surprised gasp before she called out, "Dad, you might want to come here." Grace Langford stood in their doorway, looking simultaneously elegant and uncertain. In her hands, she held a pristine white bakery box and an envelope. Her usually perfect composure seemed slightly shaken. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said softly, her eyes meeting Jack's. I remembered Emily mentioning her birthday was this week." Jack's hands clenched involuntarily at his sides, but Emily's presence beside him kept his voice steady. "That's thoughtful of you, Miss Langford. Please," she said, "call me Grace." She held out the box and envelope with slightly trembling hands. "I know things have been difficult, but Emily deserves a happy birthday." Emily looked between the two adults, hope brightening her young face. "Won't you come in? Dad made a cake too, but..." She glanced apologetically at her father. "Well, we could probably use a backup." A ghost of a smile crossed Jack's face. "It's that bad, huh?" "No, it's just..." Emily struggled to find diplomatic words. "Unique?" Grace offered, and suddenly all 3 of them were fighting grins. Jack stepped back from the doorway, making space. "You're welcome to join us, Grace. We have plenty of unique cake to go around." Grace entered their home carefully, as if stepping into a sacred space. Her designer clothes and perfect makeup contrasted sharply with their worn furniture and simple decorations, but her eyes were warm as she took it all in. Emily cleared a space on the counter for the bakery box, while Jack pulled out the extra folding chair they kept in the closet. Grace sat down, smoothing her skirt nervously before holding out the envelope to Jack. "I needed to explain," she said quietly, "about why I disappeared, about the anonymous letter." Jack accepted the envelope but didn't open it. "Maybe we should focus on celebrating first? Emily's only turning 15 once." Grace's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she nodded. Emily bounced between them, opening both cake boxes with theatrical flourish. "Look, they're both chocolate." Jack's homemade creation sat next to Grace's professional tier cake, the difference almost comical. But when Emily hugged her father, her eyes shining with love, the comparison didn't seem to matter anymore. "Make a wish, sweetheart," Jack said, lighting the candles on both cakes. Emily closed her eyes, her face serene in the warm glow. After she blew out the flames, Grace helped serve slices from both cakes. They each tried both versions, and soon they were laughing at Jack's self-deprecating jokes about his baking skills. "It's not that bad," Grace insisted, taking another bite of his cake. "It's memorable." "That's a very diplomatic way of putting it," Jack replied, and Emily giggled. As the afternoon light began to fade, the tension between them had melted like the birthday candle wax. Emily regaled Grace with stories about her father's previous cooking attempts, and Grace shared some of her own kitchen disasters. In a quiet moment, while Emily was showing Grace her art supplies in the corner, Jack found himself watching them. Grace's carefully maintained facade had softened, revealing glimpses of the person beneath the polished exterior. When she caught his eye, he spoke softly. "Maybe Faith sent you back." Grace's eyes glistened slightly as she nodded. "Maybe it did. I'm starting to believe in second chances." Emily returned to the table, carrying her sketchbook. "Dad, can Grace stay for dinner? We're having Mom's lasagna recipe." Jack looked at Grace, his expression open and genuine. "We'd like that, if you're free." "I'd be honored," Grace replied, and for the first time in weeks, her smile reached her eyes. The sound of their shared laughter filled the small house, chasing away the shadows of recent misunderstandings. For this moment at least, they were just three people sharing cake and stories, finding unexpected joy in each other's company. The morning sun cast long shadows across the workshop's weathered porch as Grace Langford stepped out of her silver Mercedes. She wore a simple blue dress instead of her usual business attire and carried a stack of papers under her arm. The gravel crunched beneath her sensible flats as she made her way to where Jack stood, sanding a piece of wood. "I have something to show you," she said, her voice gentle but excited. Jack set down his tools and wiped his hands on his worn jeans. "What's this about?" Grace spread the papers on his workbench. "I've set up a proper foundation. The Renewal Project. That's what we'll call it. Full funding, complete transparency, and a board of directors that includes both of us." Jack's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. "Grace, this is too much." "No," she said firmly. "It's exactly enough. The workshop deserves this. You deserve this." Word spread quickly through their small town. By afternoon, curious neighbors began dropping by. Mrs. Peterson from the bakery brought coffee and muffins. Tom Wilson, the hardware store owner who'd been skeptical of Jack's program for years, showed up with a truck full of donated supplies. "Heard you're making it official," Tom said gruffly, but there was warmth in his eyes. "About time someone recognized the good work you do here, Jack." The workshop buzzed with activity as former volunteers returned. Pete, a veteran who'd learned woodworking from Jack months ago, brought 2 more vets with him. "We heard you're back in business," he said, grinning. "For real this time." Grace watched from the corner as Jack showed them around, his face lit with joy. She remembered the anonymous letter that had almost destroyed this. Her shame at doubting him felt distant now, replaced by certainty that this was exactly where she needed to be. They spent the afternoon planning. Grace's business expertise complemented Jack's practical knowledge perfectly. Together, they mapped out expansion plans, training programs, and community outreach initiatives. The workshop would remain free for those who needed it most, but they'd also sell custom furniture to sustain the program. "We'll need more space," Jack mused, looking around at the crowded workshop. Grace smiled. "Already taken care of. The empty warehouse next door? I bought it this morning." Jack shook his head in amazement. "You don't do anything halfway, do you?" "Not anymore," she replied softly. "I've learned that from you." They organized a proper reopening ceremony. The whole town turned out, filling the workshop's yard with folding chairs and homemade dishes. Emily had made a new sign with their new name, the Renewal Project, painted in careful letters with flourishing vines around the edges. Mayor Thompson gave a speech about community spirit and second chances. Grace spoke about transformation and faith. But it was Jack's simple words that brought tears to people's eyes. "This place," he said, his voice steady and clear, "has always been about more than wood and nails. It's about rebuilding lives, piece by piece. Sometimes the broken parts of us just need someone to believe they're worth fixing." Grace caught his eye from the crowd, understanding flowing between them like a current. After the ceremony, as the sun began to set, they found themselves standing together on the workshop's porch. The yard had emptied, leaving only scattered chairs and paper plates that Emily and some volunteers were cleaning up. The sky blazed orange and pink, painting the workshop's weathered boards in warm light. Grace leaned against the railing, feeling more at peace than she had in years. "I never thought I'd find purpose again after Michael died," she admitted quietly. Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And I never thought I'd find strength to build something new after Sarah. Look at us now," Grace said with a small laugh. "Look at us," Jack agreed softly. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower. The workshop behind them held the echo of the day's celebrations, hope and new beginnings practically radiating from its walls. Grace glanced at Jack's profile, noting how the tension had eased from his shoulders. She'd come to rely on his steady presence, his unwavering faith. Somehow, through all their misunderstandings and reconciliations, they'd become each other's anchor. A cool evening breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sweet scent of wild honeysuckle. In the yard, Emily laughed at something one of the volunteers said, the sound bright and clear in the gathering dusk. "We did good today," Jack said simply. Grace smiled, feeling the truth of those words settle deep in her heart. "Yes," she replied, "we did." They stayed there as the shadows lengthened, two people who had found strength in each other, watching their shared dream take flight at last. The workshop, their workshop, stood solid behind them, no longer just a place of work, but a testament to healing, to faith, and to the power of starting over. The late afternoon sun filtered through the workshop's dusty windows, casting golden rectangles across the worn wooden floor as Tom Preston adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and jotted careful notes in his leather-bound notebook. The investigative reporter from the Richmond Times had spent the last hour watching Jack guide a young veteran through the intricate art of dovetail joints, his trained journalist's eye cataloging every detail of the scene unfolding before him. The workshop hummed with quiet purpose. Several men worked at different stations, a grizzled ex-convict sanding a cabinet door to silk-smooth perfection, a young veteran with haunted eyes, carefully measuring cedar planks, an older man who'd recently lost his job, learning to operate the new band, saw that Grace's funding had made possible. The air smelled of sawdust and wood stain, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of honest labor and second chances. "It's quite a remarkable story," Tom said, his voice carrying the polished tone of someone accustomed to interviewing subjects, ranging from politicians to grieving families. He tapped his pen against the notebook's margin, where he'd already filled 3 pages with observations. The billionaire's sister and the humble carpenter, brought together by tragedy and somehow finding redemption in each other's company. Jack wiped sawdust from his calloused hands with a well-worn cloth, the simple gesture speaking to years of working with his hands. His movements were deliberate and unhurried, a man comfortable in his own skin despite the circumstances that had brought this reporter to his door. "We're just trying to help people heal, Mr. Preston. Nothing more complicated to it than that." The reporter's keen eyes continued scanning the workshop, taking in the newly installed equipment that gleamed alongside older, well-maintained tools. His gaze lingered on the fresh coat of paint on the walls, the organized tool racks, the motivational posters that someone, probably Emily, had hung near the entrance. Everything spoke of renewal, of hope, rebuilt from the ground up. "And Miss Langford's involvement in all this?" Tom pressed, his pen poised above the paper. "It's quite unusual for someone of her social standing and wealth to take such a deeply personal interest in a small-town workshop project. Most philanthropists write checks and attend galas." Jack's weathered hands came to rest on the scarred surface of his workbench, fingers tracing the grain of wood that had seen countless projects come to life. "Grace understands what we're trying to accomplish here," he replied with characteristic simplicity, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of a man who'd found his calling. Sometimes the deepest healing comes through helping others find their way back to wholeness. Tom nodded thoughtfully, scribbling more notes in his precise handwriting. The story was shaping up to be exactly the kind of human interest piece that could propel his career forward. Wealthy philanthropist finds purpose through connection with working-class widower. It had all the elements: tragedy, redemption, unlikely friendship, and the kind of heartwarming resolution that readers couldn't resist sharing on social media. "I'll need to verify some details about the original accident, of course," Tom mentioned casually, closing his notebook with a decisive snap. "Standard procedure for any story of this magnitude. Can't have any loose ends when it goes to print." Jack's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift that spoke to wounds that hadn't fully healed despite 5 years of careful tending. But he maintained his calm demeanor, the same steady presence that had guided countless broken men through their own dark hours. "That was 5 years ago, Mr. Preston. We've all made our peace with it as best we can." Later that afternoon, Tom found himself seated in the fluorescent-lit confines of the county records office, surrounded by manila folders thick with official documents and police reports that smelled of old paper and bureaucratic efficiency. His coffee had grown cold hours ago as he methodically pieced together the details of that rainy night 5 years past, when 2 lives had been lost and 2 families forever changed. The accident report lay open before him like a roadmap to tragedy, its clinical language and official terminology at stark odds with the profound human suffering it documented. Tom's journalist training had taught him to read between the lines of such reports, to find the human story buried beneath layers of legal jargon and procedural language. His finger traced down the typed page, stopping at a crucial detail he'd nearly overlooked in his initial reading. According to multiple witness statements taken at the scene, Sarah Miller's sedan had drifted slightly over the yellow center line in the moments immediately before impact. The report's dry language suggested she might have been reaching for something in her passenger seat, possibly her purse, which officers had found spilled across the floorboard. Tom's pulse quickened as he read further, his reporter's instincts recognizing the significance of what he'd discovered. Michael Langford's blood alcohol level had indeed been well over the legal limit, a fact that had dominated the original news coverage. But buried deeper in the technical details was another truth. Sarah Miller's momentary distraction, her split-second lapse in attention, had contributed to the head-on collision that claimed both their lives. The official report listed both drivers as bearing partial responsibility for the accident. Tom leaned back in his chair, staring at the document that could change everything. This wasn't just a story about redemption and unlikely friendship anymore. This was about hidden truths, about the complex nature of blame and forgiveness, about whether Grace Langford's generosity had been motivated by knowledge she'd kept hidden. The story hit the Richmond Times website at precisely 7 a.m. the next morning, time for maximum impact during the morning commute. By noon, printed copies were being passed from hand to hand throughout the small town. The headline, stark and unforgiving in bold black letters: "Tragic accident that united unlikely friends reveals shared blame. New details emerge about night that changed 2 families forever." Jack discovered the truth while making his usual morning stop at May's Diner for coffee and the kind of easy conversation that had always been as much a part of his routine as his work. But this morning felt different from the moment he walked through the door. The usual chorus of friendly greetings died away, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to follow him across the worn linoleum floor. Regular customers who had known him for 20 years suddenly found their breakfast plates fascinating. May herself, a woman who'd fed half the town through good times and bad, wouldn't meet his eyes as she moved behind the counter with uncharacteristic stiffness. The elderly waitress who had served Jack coffee every morning for years silently pushed the folded newspaper toward him across the Formica counter, her lined face full of the kind of sympathy usually reserved for funeral parlors. Her hand shook slightly as she poured his coffee. The simple gesture weighted with unspoken understanding of the pain he was about to experience. Jack read the article standing right there at the counter, his untouched coffee growing cold beside him. The reporter had been thorough in his research, quoting extensively from police reports and interviewing accident reconstruction specialists who'd worked the scene 5 years ago. The truth about Sarah's role in the collision was laid bare in methodical, devastating detail, along with pointed speculation about whether the Langford family had possessed this knowledge all along. Each paragraph felt like a physical blow. The clinical description of Sarah's final moments, the analysis of how her car had crossed the center line, the expert testimony about reaction times and contributing factors, all of it combined to paint a picture that shattered Jack's carefully constructed understanding of that terrible night. At the Langford estate, Grace sat in the leather chair behind her mahogany desk, her manicured hands trembling as she read the digital version on her tablet. The morning light streaming through her study's tall windows seemed harsh and unforgiving as she absorbed every damning word. The article didn't just reveal the hidden details of the accident, it questioned her motives, wondering aloud whether her generous funding of Jack's workshop had been motivated by guilt over suppressing these crucial facts. The suggestion burned through her like acid, even though it wasn't true. She genuinely hadn't known about Sarah's role in the accident. But the reporter's carefully worded insinuations made her generosity seem calculated, transforming acts of genuine compassion into something manipulative and self-serving. Grace set down the tablet and walked to her window, looking out at the perfectly manicured grounds that had never seemed so much like a prison. In the distance, she could see the cemetery where she and Jack had found their unlikely connection. Now that sacred ground felt tainted. Their shared grief transformed into something more complex and painful. By mid-afternoon, the workshop that had buzzed with purposeful activity just hours before stood eerily empty. The veterans and ex-inmates who usually filled the space with the rhythmic sounds of sawing and hammering had quietly melted away, unsure how to face their mentor in light of these revelations. Tools lay abandoned on workbenches, half-finished projects gathering dust in the sudden silence. Jack sat alone at his familiar workbench, staring at the half-completed rocking chair before him, a piece he'd been crafting for a young mother whose husband was serving overseas. His hands, usually so steady and sure, trembled as Sarah's last moments played through his mind on an endless, torturous loop. Now those final seconds were tainted with this new knowledge, this terrible understanding that she too had played a role in the tragedy that defined both their lives. The workshop's door creaked open on its hinges, the sound echoing through the empty space like a gunshot. Grace stood silhouetted in the doorway, her usual confidence and poise completely stripped away. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of revelation and its aftermath. "Jack, I didn't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear on everything I hold sacred, I didn't know about Sarah's part in it." He couldn't bring himself to look at her, couldn't bear to see his own pain reflected in her eyes. The tools and wood shavings before him seemed more real than the woman whose generosity had given him hope for the first time in years. "Please leave, Grace," he said quietly, each word carefully measured. "We can explain this to people," she pressed, desperation creeping into her voice. "We can hold a town meeting, issue statements. We can make them understand that neither of us knew." "Leave." His voice remained quiet but carried the unmistakable weight of fresh grief, of a man who had been hollowed out by one revelation too many. "Just, please leave." She turned to go, her heels clicking against the concrete floor, with a hollow sound that seemed to emphasize the emptiness surrounding them. Then she paused, her hand on the doorframe, and spoke without turning around. "The daisies you brought to Michael's grave all this time were from Sarah's garden," he finished, still not looking up from his hands. His voice carried the weight of terrible irony. The same garden where she was reaching for her purse that night. The garden that became beautiful because of her care, but also distracted her enough to... He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to the cruel mathematics of that split second that had changed everything. Grace left without another word, stepping out into a world that suddenly felt hostile and unforgiving. Outside, neighbors who would normally wave and call out cheerful greetings now hurried past with carefully averted eyes. Mrs. Henderson, who had baked Jack cookies after Sarah's death, quickly crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Grace approaching. The town that had celebrated their unlikely friendship and remarkable journey of healing now buzzed with whispered conversations and pointed speculation. Children who had been taught to see Jack as a hero, a man who'd transformed tragedy into purpose, now heard their parents speaking in hushed tones about blame and hidden truths. The simple narrative of forgiveness and redemption had become complicated, messy, human in all the ways that made people uncomfortable. In the cemetery that evening, both graves stood stark and bare under the fading light. No fresh daisies graced either headstone, breaking a tradition that had brought comfort and meaning for 5 long years. The setting sun cast long, reaching shadows across the weathered markers. The names of Michael Langford and Sarah Miller etched in cold stone, their shared tragedy now carrying a different weight entirely. The silence in the graveyard felt different too, not peaceful, but hollow. Even the evening breeze seemed to carry whispers of judgment and disappointment, transforming a place of healing into a reminder of how quickly hope could crumble when the full truth finally came to light. Grace's silver Mercedes pulled into the graveled driveway of Jack's workshop, kicking up dust in the golden afternoon light. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, watching Jack through the window. He stood at his workbench, mechanically sanding a piece of wood, his shoulders rigid with tension. The newspaper lay crumpled on his bench, its headlines stark and accusing. Double tragedy, new evidence shows, shared blame and fatal crash. Grace stepped out of her car, her heels crunching on the gravel. The sound made Jack pause, but he didn't turn around. The workshop felt colder somehow, despite the warm spring air drifting through the open doors. "Jack," Grace said softly, her voice catching, "please, let me explain. I had no idea about the investigation. If I'd known." "Known what?" Jack's voice was flat, emotionless. He kept sanding, his movements becoming more aggressive. "Known that my wife was texting while driving? That she shared the blame for your brother's death? That I've been." He stopped, his hand gripping the sandpaper until his knuckles turned white. Emily appeared in the doorway connecting the workshop to their small house, her young face creased with worry. She held her sketchbook close to her chest like a shield. "Dad?" she whispered. Jack finally turned around, but his eyes wouldn't meet Grace's. "Emily, go inside, honey." "But Dad, please." His voice cracked on the word. Emily's lower lip trembled as she looked between them. Tears welled in her eyes as she backed away slowly, disappearing into the house. Grace took a step forward, her hand outstretched. "Jack, this doesn't change anything. What you've done here, what we've built together, doesn't change anything?" Jack's laugh was harsh, unlike anything Grace had heard from him before. "It changes everything. Every prayer I said at Michael's grave, every time I told myself I'd forgiven him completely." He shook his head. Sarah was distracted. She was texting me, about picking up milk on her way home. Grace felt her throat tighten. "We all made mistakes that day. Michael was drunk. I've spent 6 years telling myself I was some kind of saint for forgiving your brother." Jack turned away. Again, his shoulders slumping. "But I was just as guilty. I should have known better than to text her back. I knew she always replied right away, no matter what." Through the thin walls, they could hear Emily's muffled sobs from inside the house. The sound seemed to pierce Jack's armor, making him flinch. "The workshop can't open tomorrow," he said quietly, "or the day after. I need time." "Jack, please don't do this. The people here need you." "Emily needs what Emily needs," he cut in, his voice sharp, "is a father who isn't living a lie, who isn't pretending to be something he's not." Grace watched helplessly as Jack began shutting down the workshop, turning off machines, covering projects with drop cloths. His movements were mechanical, devoid of his usual care and precision. "I'll keep funding everything," Grace said desperately. "We can take a break, but please don't give up on. Your money can't fix this, Grace." Jack's words struck like physical blows. "It never could, I thought. I thought God had brought us together for healing, for some greater purpose. But maybe I was just fooling myself. Maybe I needed to believe in forgiveness so badly that I invented it." Emily's crying grew louder, and Jack's face crumpled. He pressed his palms against his workbench, head bowed. "Please leave," he whispered. Grace stood frozen, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Jack, please." She backed away slowly, her heel catching on the threshold. Through blurry eyes, she saw Emily watching from her bedroom window upstairs, her small hand pressed against the glass. The drive home was a blur. Grace's world had tilted on its axis, leaving her unmoored and aching. She pulled over at the cemetery, but couldn't bring herself to visit Michael's grave. The weight of their shared guilt, their tangled past, felt too heavy to bear. Back at the workshop, Jack locked up for the night, his movements slow and heavy. Emily had cried herself to sleep, her sketchbook open to a drawing of their little family, him, Emily, and Grace, surrounded by blooming daisies. In the darkness of his bedroom, Jack knelt beside his bed, hands clasped as they had been every night for the past 6 years. But the words wouldn't come. The familiar comfort of prayer felt hollow, tainted by his own hypocrisy. "Lord," he started, then stopped. The silence stretched out, broken only by the ticking of the bedside clock Sarah had given him for their last anniversary. Finally, he spoke into the darkness, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Maybe I've been lying to myself about forgiveness." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Outside his window, the workshop stood silent and dark, its promise of renewal now just another reminder of his failure. Thunder rolled across the darkening Virginia sky as Grace folded another silk blouse into her leather suitcase. The massive windows of her study reflected lightning strikes, illuminating the carefully organized stacks of papers on her desk, preparations for her permanent return to New York. Her fingers brushed against a small wooden box Jack had made for her just weeks ago. The simple craftsmanship spoke of care and attention, with delicate flower patterns carved into its lid. She picked it up, her throat tightening. "Miss Langford?" Martha, her housekeeper, appeared in the doorway. "The weather service says it's getting worse. Should I call the car service to cancel?" "No," Grace said firmly, placing the box back down. "I need to leave tonight. The sooner, the better." Rain pelted against the windows with increasing fury. Grace moved methodically through her study, gathering the last of her personal items. Each object seemed to mock her with memories. The coffee mug she'd used during late-night workshop planning sessions with Jack. The community calendar marked with events they'd organized together. "I've only made things worse," she whispered to herself, echoing the thoughts that had haunted her for days. The newspaper article had ripped open wounds she thought were healing. Learning that Sarah, Jack's wife, had been checking her phone when Michael swerved into their lane felt like a cruel joke. All this time, Jack had carried that knowledge while showing nothing but kindness. Martha returned with hot tea, her weathered face creased with concern. "Miss Langford, maybe wait until morning?" "This storm, I can't," Grace's voice cracked. "I've brought enough pain to this town, to him." Lightning flashed again, followed by an immediate crack of thunder that rattled the windows. Grace's phone buzzed with a weather alert. She glanced at it absently, then froze. "Emergency alert. Large oak down near Willow Creek Cemetery. One vehicle reported trapped. Emergency services en route." Her heart stopped. Jack always visited the graves during storms, saying the rain made him feel closer to heaven. She'd thought it odd at first, but now? "Martha, where are my car keys?" "Miss Langford, you can't possibly. The keys!" Her voice rose sharply. Martha hurried to fetch them, returning moments later. "At least take an umbrella," Martha called after her. But Grace was already running through the foyer, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The rain hit her like a wall of water as she dashed to her car. The Mercedes engine roared to life, and she pulled out onto the empty streets. Windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour as she navigated the familiar route to Willow Creek Cemetery. Streetlights flickered and swayed in the wind. Branches littered the road, forcing her to swerve several times. As she approached the cemetery gates, her headlights caught the massive form of a fallen oak sprawled across the entrance. A police car's lights flashed in the distance, but no other vehicles were visible. Grace parked haphazardly and stepped out into the storm. Her designer clothes were soaked instantly, but she barely noticed. Lightning illuminated the cemetery in stark flashes as she pushed through the gate's pedestrian entrance. "Jack," she called out, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Jack!" She stumbled along the familiar path, her shoes sinking into the mud. The graves loomed like dark shadows in the rain. Finally, she reached Michael's plot, and there he was. Jack knelt between the two graves, Michael's and Sarah's, his head bowed and shoulders shaking. He wore no jacket, his shirt plastered to his back by the rain. He seemed oblivious to the storm raging around him. "Jack!" Grace rushed forward, her feet slipping on the wet grass. He didn't look up, but she heard his voice, rough with emotion. "I couldn't do it anymore, couldn't pretend I had the right to forgive." Grace dropped to her knees beside him, heedless of the mud. "What are you talking about?" "Sarah was texting me," he said, his words tumbling out. "She was answering my message when it happened. If I hadn't," his voice broke. "Stop!" Grace grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. His face was wet with rain and tears. "You've been carrying this all alone? I thought if I could forgive your brother, maybe God would forgive me." He closed his eyes. "But I've been lying to everyone, to Emily, to you." Lightning cracked overhead, but Grace barely noticed. Everything suddenly made sense. His daily visits, his desperate need to help others, the weight she'd sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "My brother chose to drink that night. Sarah choosing to read your message didn't make him drive drunk. We've all been carrying pieces of guilt that don't belong to us." Rain streamed down their faces as their eyes met. In that moment, Grace saw her own pain reflected in Jack's gaze. The burden of responsibility, the crushing weight of what-ifs, the desperate need for absolution. "I was leaving town," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Running away because I thought I'd only brought you more pain. But we can't keep running from this, Jack. We can't keep letting that night destroy more lives." A police officer's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, followed by a distant shout. But Grace and Jack remained kneeling in the rain, caught in a moment of shared understanding that went deeper than words. "I'm so tired," Jack whispered, his shoulders sagging, "tired of pretending I'm strong enough to carry this." "Then let me help you carry it," Grace said, taking his cold hands in hers. "That's what we've been doing wrong, trying to bear it alone." The storm continued to rage around them, but in that moment, something shifted between them. A wall crumbling, a truth finally acknowledged. They knelt together in the rain, two broken people finally facing their shared pain honestly. The rain pounded mercilessly against the cemetery grounds, turning the carefully maintained paths into muddy rivers. Grace's designer boots sank into the soft earth as she rushed toward the hunched figure by the graves. Her heart pounded, not from the exertion, but from the sight of Jack Miller kneeling there, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in harsh white light. Jack didn't even flinch. His clothes were soaked through, plastered against his body, but he seemed oblivious to the cold. His eyes were fixed on the two headstones before him, Michael Langford's and Sarah Miller's, as if searching for answers in the rain-streaked marble. "Jack!" Grace called out over the howling wind. When he didn't respond, she moved closer, her voice softening. "Please, you'll catch your death out here." He turned then, his face haggard in the dim light. "Maybe that would be fitting," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "All this time, I thought I was doing right by them both, praying, forgiving, but Sarah," his voice caught. She was texting while driving. She shared the blame for Michael's death. "How can I forgive that?" Grace knelt beside him in the mud, her expensive clothes forgotten. The rain plastered her hair to her face, but she barely noticed. "And I enabled Michael's drinking," she admitted. "We all carry blame, Jack. All of us." Thunder rolled overhead as Jack shook his head. "I've lost it, Grace. My faith, my certainty, everything I believed in feels like a lie." His hands clenched into fists. How could God let me spend years thinking I had it all figured out, only to discover I was wrong about everything? Grace reached out, hesitating only a moment before placing her hand on his shoulder. "Faith isn't found in answers, Jack. It's found in holding on." The words surprised her. They felt like they came from somewhere deeper than her own understanding. Jack looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and questioning. "How can you say that? After everything?" "Because I've learned something from you," she said softly. "All these years, I thought Michael's death was my punishment for being a bad sister. I built walls, turned to money and control to feel safe. But watching you come here every day, leaving those daisies, praying for both of them," she swallowed hard. "You showed me that grace isn't about deserving it. It's about receiving it anyway." The rain began to soften, no longer stinging, but falling in gentle sheets around them. Jack's breathing steadied as he listened to her words. "My brother died because of choices he made, choices I enabled," Grace continued. "Your wife made a mistake that contributed to it. We're all broken, Jack. But maybe that's exactly why we need faith. Not because we have all the answers, but because we don't." Jack's shoulders began to shake, and Grace couldn't tell if it was from cold or emotion. She moved closer, offering what warmth she could. "Will you pray with me?" she asked quietly. For a long moment, only the sound of falling rain filled the space between them. Then Jack nodded, almost imperceptibly. Grace took his hand, cold and wet in hers, and bowed her head. "Dear God," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "we come to you broken and confused. We don't understand why things happened the way they did. We don't know how to carry all this pain. But we're here," Jack continued, his voice rough with emotion. "We're still here." Together, they prayed in the rain, not for answers or understanding, but for the strength to keep holding on. Their words, mixed with the falling water, honest and raw and healing. They prayed for Michael and Sarah, for Emily, for themselves, and for the courage to face whatever came next. As they sat in silence afterward, the storm began to fade. The first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, pale light seeping through breaks in the clouds. The rain gentled to a soft mist, and then stopped altogether. Morning light touched the cemetery grounds, creating tiny rainbows in the water droplets clinging to the grass. And, as there, scattered across both graves, lay rain-soaked daisies, some from Jack's daily visits, others blown by the storm, their white petals glowing in the newborn day. They remained kneeling together, watching as the sun slowly transformed the scene around them. The graves no longer looked like monuments to loss, but rather markers of a journey, one that had led two broken people to this moment of shared understanding and renewed faith. "Thank you," Jack whispered, and Grace knew he wasn't just talking to her. The morning after, the storm dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself had washed away the darkness of the previous night. Sunlight streamed through the workshop's weathered windows, casting long shadows across the sawdust-covered floor. Jack stood at his familiar workbench, running his calloused hands over the smooth surface of an unfinished table. Grace's heels clicked against the wooden floor as she entered, still wearing yesterday's rain-spotted clothes. Her usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, but her eyes held a new determination. She carried a cardboard box filled with papers and folders. "I called my assistant," she said, setting the box down. "Told her to cancel my flight and all my meetings for the next month." Jack looked up from his work, his expression softening. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Grace interrupted, pulling out a folder. Last night showed me something. We've both been carrying guilt that wasn't ours alone to bear. Maybe it's time we helped others do the same. She spread the papers across the workbench, blueprints for an expanded workshop, financial projections, and a list of local families in need. I've been thinking about what you said about second chances. What if we rebuild the renewal project with a new purpose? Jack picked up one of the blueprints, studying it carefully. What kind of purpose? There are 15 widowed spouses in our town alone, Grace explained, pointing to a list. 3 of them lost their partners in military service. Another 8 are struggling single parents. They all need what we found here, not just help, but hope. Emily appeared in the doorway, carrying her art supplies. She'd been listening, and her face lit up with possibility. Like how Mom's garden helped us after she died? She asked, setting up her easel in the corner. Jack's eyes grew misty. Sarah always said her flowers were therapy. Exactly, Grace said softly. She pulled out more documents. I've already contacted several veterans organizations. They're willing to partner with us. We can offer woodworking classes, but also grief counseling, job training, childcare support. Jack picked up his tools, turning them over in his hands thoughtfully. It would mean changing everything we've built here. No, Grace corrected gently. It means building on what's already here. Your carpentry skills, your heart for teaching, my resources, we just expand the mission. Workshop filled with morning light as they discussed the details. Grace explained how they could convert the storage room into a meeting space for support groups. Jack suggested adding a children's area where kids could feel safe while their parents learn new skills. Throughout the morning, former volunteers began trickling in, drawn by the lights and activity. Each one listened to the new vision, and one by one, they offered to help. Tom, a veteran himself, volunteered to lead peer support sessions. Maria, who'd lost her husband 2 years ago, said she could coordinate the childcare program. Emily worked quietly in her corner, brushstrokes steady and sure. Her canvas gradually filled with color, soft greens and golds, purple shadows, and the bright white of daisies breaking through dark earth. By afternoon, the workshop hummed with purpose. Jack and 2 volunteers cleared space for the new meeting room while Grace made calls to contractors and counselors. The sound of hammers and saws mixed with laughter and conversation, sounds of renewal. "Dad," Emily called out eventually. "Grace, come look." They gathered around her easel. The painting showed the workshop's facade, but transformed. Climbing roses and morning glories framed the door. Daisies pushed through cracks in the walkway. Above it all, in flowing script, were the words, "From brokenness to bloom." Grace touched the still wet paint gently. "It's perfect," she whispered. Jack squeezed his daughter's shoulder. "Your mother would love it, sweetheart," Emily beamed. "Can we put it outside so everyone knows what happens here?" Grace nodded. "Of course. It'll be the first thing people see when they come looking for hope." Together, they carried the painting outside. The afternoon sun caught the wet paint, making the daisies seem to glow. Jack held the canvas steady while Grace helped Emily hang it carefully above the entrance. Standing back, they admired the sign and what it represented, not just their own healing, but the promise of helping others find their way through grief to growth. The workshop behind them buzzed with activity, already transforming into something new and beautiful, just like the daisies that had started it all. The workshop buzzed with activity on that bright Monday morning. Volunteers streamed through the doors, carrying tools and supplies, their voices filling the once quiet space with warmth and purpose. Grace stood near the entrance, her designer clothes replaced by simple jeans and a work shirt, her hair tied back in a practical ponytail. "Where do you want these 2x4s, Jack?" asked Tom, a veteran who'd been with the workshop since the beginning. His weathered face broke into a genuine smile as he nodded at Grace. "Good to see you back, Miss Langford." "Please, it's just Grace now," she said, picking up the other end of the lumber to help him. Her manicured hands, unused to manual labor, gripped the rough wood without hesitation. Jack emerged from his office, his eyes brightening at the sight of the growing crowd. "Over by the west wall, Tom, we're building new storage shelves today." He paused, watching Grace work alongside the others with quiet appreciation. Throughout the morning, more townspeople arrived. Sarah Chin from the local diner brought coffee and pastries. Bill Matthews, the hardware store owner, dropped off boxes of donated supplies. Even Mayor Thompson stopped by, rolling up his sleeves to help sand down some chairs. "Never thought I'd see the day," whispered Mrs. Peterson to her friend as they watched Grace teach a young veteran how to measure wood properly. A Langford getting sawdust on her clothes. Jack overheard and shook his head. Grace isn't just a Langford, he said firmly. She's part of our family now. By noon, the workshop hummed with the sound of saws and hammers. Grace worked steadily, learning from everyone around her. When she made mistakes, she laughed at herself and tried again. Her vulnerability drew others closer, breaking down the invisible barriers that wealth and status had built. Town hall meetings at 7, Mayor Thompson reminded everyone during lunch break, "We'd love to hear about your vision for the workshop's future." That evening, the town hall filled to capacity. Familiar faces from the morning's work sat shoulder to shoulder with curious newcomers. Grace chose a seat in the middle rows, deliberately avoiding the VIP section where she usually sat during charity events. Jack stood at the podium, his work clothes exchanged for a clean plaid shirt. His hands, still bearing traces of sawdust, gripped the wooden stand. "Many of you know me as the carpenter who lost his wife," he began, his voice steady but humble. "Some know me as the man who left flowers on Michael Langford's grave. Tonight, I want to tell you the whole story." The room fell silent. Grace felt her heart quicken as Jack spoke about Sarah, about Michael, about the accident that connected two families in grief. He didn't hide the recent revelations about shared responsibility, nor did he minimize the pain of discovery. "I thought I understood forgiveness," Jack continued, his eyes meeting Grace's briefly. "I thought by praying at Michael's grave, I was showing true grace. But real forgiveness isn't just about the past. It's about what we choose to build from the ashes of our pain." Several people wiped tears as Jack described how Grace had first helped the workshop anonymously, how fear and misunderstanding had nearly destroyed their second chance, and how a storm had brought them back to the truth they both needed to face. "This workshop isn't just about carpentry anymore," Jack said, his voice growing stronger. "It's about renewal. Not just of furniture or buildings, but of hearts and lives. Grace Langford taught me that even when we think we're the ones doing the forgiving, sometimes we're the ones who need forgiveness most." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The gossip that had divided the town seemed to evaporate in the face of such honest vulnerability. "Some of you may still wonder why a billionaire sister would choose to spend her days in a dusty workshop," Jack acknowledged. "But I've learned that true worth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the courage it takes to face your past, to admit your mistakes, and to choose a different path forward." Grace felt tears well up as she remembered her morning struggles with the measuring tape, the patient encouragement of the volunteers, the simple joy of creating something with her own hands. "We can't change our past," Jack concluded, his gaze sweeping across the room, "but we can redeem our tomorrow. This workshop isn't just my story anymore, or even Grace's story. It's our story, all of us who believe in second chances." Grace smiled from her seat in the audience, her heart full. Around her, she could feel the shift in the room, not just acceptance, but understanding. The whispers had stopped. The judgment had melted away. In its place was something more precious: hope. The mayor stood to speak next, but the real work had already been done. Jack's words had built a bridge stronger than any hammer and nails could fashion, a bridge between past and future, between wealth and simplicity, between broken hearts and healing souls. As applause filled the room, Grace caught Jack's eye and nodded slightly. They both knew that tomorrow would bring more challenges, more work, more opportunities to prove that forgiveness wasn't just a word, it was a choice they would make every day, just like the daily decision to place flowers on those graves. The workshop stood quiet in the deepening twilight, tools carefully arranged on the walls, sawdust swept into neat piles. The day's work was done, but two figures remained. Through the open garage door, crickets chirped their evening song, accompanying the gentle clink of coffee mugs. Jack Miller sat on his favorite wooden bench, one he'd crafted years ago from reclaimed oak. Next to him, Grace Langford cradled a steaming mug between her hands, her shoulders relaxed in a way they never were at her mansion. "You know," Jack said softly, "I keep expecting to wake up and find you gone, back to your real life in New York." Grace studied the ripples in her coffee. "This feels more real than anything I've known in years." The evening air carried the sweet scent of fresh-cut pine and late summer jasmine. Jack's weathered hands wrapped around his own mug, his wedding ring catching the last rays of sunlight. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for staying, for believing in this place when even I had lost faith." Grace turned to him, her eyes soft in the fading light. "I think I needed this place more than it needed me." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to purple. A few early stars peeked through the gathering dusk. The moment felt sacred somehow, like a prayer without words. "Sarah would have liked you," Jack said suddenly, then looked surprised at his own words. Grace's breath caught. They rarely spoke of Sarah directly, though her presence filled every corner of the workshop, from the dried daisies hanging in Jack's office to the little touches of beauty in the garden outside. "Really?" Grace whispered. Jack nodded, his eyes distant but peaceful. "She always said that broken things were just waiting to be made beautiful again, like the furniture we restore here." He paused, running his finger along the rim of his mug. "She would have seen how you've helped heal this place, how you've helped heal me." Grace set her coffee down, her hands trembling slightly. "I was so lost after Michael died. I thought throwing money at charities would fix everything, fix me. But being here, working alongside everyone, seeing real change happen." She shook her head. "It's different." "Sarah used to say that too." Jack smiled gently. "That real healing happens, heart to heart, not hand to wallet." "Tell me more about her?" Grace asked softly. It was the first time she directly asked about Sarah. Jack's eyes grew misty, but his voice was steady. "She loved summer evenings like this. She'd sit right here, planning projects for her students she taught 3rd grade, and tell me all her dreams for making the world kinder." He took a deep breath. "These past few weeks, sometimes when I'm working, I can almost hear her laughing. Not sad anymore, but happy, like she knows everything's going to be all right." Grace felt tears well up in her eyes. Do you think she would mind that I'm here?" Jack turned to face her fully, his expression tender. "Grace, I feel her blessing in this. In you being here, in how you've helped Emily smile again, in how you've brought life back to this workshop." His voice grew husky. "Sarah always believed in second chances. She'd say this was God's way of healing all of us." The stars were fully out now, scattered like diamond dust across the darkening sky. A cool breeze rustled through the workshop, carrying the lingering scent of wood shavings and possibility. Grace felt something shift inside her, a final wall crumbling, a last fear releasing its grip. Without thinking, she leaned her head against Jack's shoulder, feeling his solid presence, his quiet strength. He didn't stiffen or pull away. Instead, his breathing remained steady, peaceful. Together, they watched the stars multiply in the deepening night. Two souls bound not by passion or romance, but by something deeper, a love born from loss, transformed through faith, and strengthened by shared purpose. The crickets sang their evening symphony, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. The workshop that had once been just a place of broken things had become a sanctuary of healing, not just for the furniture and the people they helped, but for their own wounded hearts as well. In that moment, under the vast canvas of stars, they were no longer the billionaire's sister and the widowed carpenter. They were simply two people who had found their way through grief to grace, through darkness to light, through loneliness to love, a love as pure and gentle as the evening breeze, as steady and true as the North Star shining above them. The autumn sun painted golden streaks across the workshop's freshly painted sign, the Renewal Project, from brokenness to bloom. Paper lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, strung between wooden posts that Jack and his veterans had carved by hand. Folding chairs dotted the grassy area behind the workshop, filled with familiar faces from town, veterans in pressed uniforms, families clutching program pamphlets, and community members who'd become part of their extended family. Grace Langford stood near the back, watching the scene unfold with misty eyes. She wore a simple blue dress, her usual designer labels replaced by something more fitting for their humble celebration. Her hand rested on a table, displaying photo albums, images of the past year's transformations, both of the workshop and its people. Emily, now 16, stepped up to the makeshift podium, her dark hair catching the evening light. She smoothed her flowered dress, took a deep breath, and looked out at the crowd. The chatter settled into expectant silence. "A year ago," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "This place was just Dad's workshop. We were struggling, hurting, and lonely." She glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly. But then something magical happened. It started with a single daisy. The crowd leaned forward, many knowing pieces of the story but never having heard it from Emily's perspective. Every morning, Dad would pick a daisy from Mom's garden and take it to the cemetery. Not to Mom's grave, though. Emily's voice softened. He'd place it on Michael Langford's grave, the man who died in the same accident as my mom. Grace pressed her hands together, her eyes fixed on Emily. Several people turned to look at her, but she remained steady, pride evident in her gentle smile. "I used to think Dad was crazy," Emily continued, drawing a warm chuckle from the audience. "Why would he honor the man who was part of the accident that took Mom away? But Dad taught me something profound about forgiveness. He showed me that holding on to anger only keeps your heart locked in a cage." Jack stood at the side, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. The setting sun caught the silver in his hair, and his eyes shone with unshed tears. "Then Miss Langford came into our lives." Emily gestured toward Grace. She saw Dad leaving those flowers and thought, well, she probably thought he was crazy too. More laughter rippled through the crowd, but that single daisy became a bridge between two broken hearts. It showed us that sometimes the greatest healing comes from the most unexpected places. Several veterans nodded, their own experiences of unexpected healing reflected in Emily's words. One man wiped his eyes quietly, his prosthetic hand gripping his wife's fingers. "Look around you." Emily swept her arm across the gathering. "See all these tables Dad and our veterans made? Each one tells a story of healing. See those rocking chairs on the porch? They were built by hands, learning to trust themselves again. And that beautiful arch at the entrance? That was our whole community coming together, piece by piece." The wooden arch stood proud against the darkening sky, intricate carvings of daisies and vines winding up its sides, a testament to countless hours of patient work and teaching. "Miss Langford could have just written checks," Emily continued. "Dad could have kept his forgiveness private, but they chose to build something bigger than themselves. They taught me that true strength isn't in standing alone, it's in reaching out your hand to others, even when you're hurting." Grace moved forward slowly, coming to stand near Jack. Without looking at each other, their hands found each other's, fingers intertwining naturally. "Today, we're not just celebrating a successful business or a community project." Emily's voice grew stronger. "We're celebrating the power of forgiveness. We're celebrating second chances and new beginnings. Most of all, we're celebrating love. Not just romantic love, but the kind of love that builds bridges across impossible gaps." The audience broke into spontaneous applause. Several people stood, including the veterans who'd found purpose again within these walls. Emily beamed, her cheeks flushed with emotion. "So the next time you see a daisy growing through a crack in the sidewalk," she concluded, "remember this story. Remember that beauty can bloom in the most unlikely places, and that forgiveness can turn the deepest pain into unexpected joy." As the applause swelled, Jack squeezed Grace's hand gently. "It all started at a grave," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the crowd's response. Grace leaned slightly closer, her shoulder brushing his. Around them, people were standing, clapping, some wiping tears from their eyes. The workshop glowed in the last rays of sunlight, its windows warm with golden light, the sound of celebration echoing off its walls. Emily stepped down from the podium and rushed to hug her father and Grace, the three of them forming a tight circle as the community continued to applaud. The moment held all the power of their journey, from broken pieces to this beautiful whole, from separate griefs to shared healing. The crowd's standing ovation washed over them like a blessing, carrying with it all the hope and redemption they'd found together. In that moment, surrounded by the family they'd built, the workshop stood as more than just a building. It was a testament to the transformative power of forgiveness, one daisy at a time. The morning mist clung to the grass at Willow Creek Cemetery like a gentle blanket, each blade adorned with pearls of dew that caught and scattered the first tentative rays of dawn. The air held that special kind of quiet that only comes in the early hours, a reverent hush that seemed to whisper of memories, long treasured and wounds finally healed. Ancient oaks stood sentinel over the rolling grounds, their leaves rustling softly in the gentle breeze that carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle from the nearby fence line. Two figures walked slowly along the winding gravel path between the weathered headstones, their footsteps creating the softest crunch on the dewy grass. They moved without hurry, savoring the sacred ritual that had become as natural as breathing. Jack Miller's weathered hands, scarred from years of honest carpentry work, cradled two fresh daisies with infinite care. The flowers had come from Emily's garden, the same plot where Sarah had once knelt to plant hope in dark soil. Their white petals glowed bright against the purple shadows of morning, each bloom perfect in its simple beauty. Beside him, Grace Langford walked with quiet purpose, her usual sharp business attire replaced by a soft blue sweater and well-worn jeans that Emily had helped her pick out. The transformation in her appearance reflected the deeper change within walls torn down, defenses laid aside, their shoulders occasionally brushed as they navigated the familiar path, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that spoke of trust earned through shared tears and mutual forgiveness. Grace's hand occasionally found Jack's elbow when the path grew uneven, not because she needed the support, but because the simple touch had become a language between them, one of connection and understanding. The cemetery caretaker, Henry Webb, looked up from his morning duties near the old chapel and touched the weathered brim of his cap in greeting. His kind eyes, set deep in a face lined by decades of witnessing grief transform into acceptance, crinkled at the corners. He'd watched their story unfold from the very beginning, when Jack first started bringing those daily daisies like clockwork. In those early days, the young widower's face had been a mask of raw pain. Now Henry saw something entirely different in both their faces: peace, hard-won and genuine, radiating from them like morning light. The old caretaker returned to his work with a satisfied smile, knowing that some stories end exactly as they should. They approached the two graves that had brought them together through providence and pain. Sarah Miller's headstone stood elegant and simple, its granite surface polished to reflect the sky above. The inscription read simply, "Beloved wife and mother her love lives on." Nearby, Michael Langford's black marble marker caught and reflected the growing sunlight like a mirror. Both graves showed signs of frequent, loving care, grass trimmed with precision, stones cleaned until they gleamed, and the gentle brown remnants of daisies from previous visits, creating a carpet of remembrance. Jack's calloused fingers traced the familiar path of Sarah's engraved name, the letters worn smooth by countless such gestures. "You know," he said softly, his voice barely disturbing the morning stillness, "I used to worry that moving forward meant leaving her behind. But that wasn't true at all." Grace touched his arm gently, her palm warm against his weathered work shirt. "Sarah's love made you who you are, just like Michael's mistakes helped shape who I've become." Her voice carried no bitterness now, only the deep understanding that comes from walking through fire and emerging whole. "We're not leaving them behind, we're carrying them forward." They stood together in the growing light, two souls transformed by loss and redemption, their shadows stretching long across the dew-dampened ground. Jack held out one of the daisies to Grace, its stem still cool from Emily's garden. Their fingers brushed as she took it, a touch that spoke of shared healing and the quiet miracle of hearts learning to trust again. Grace knelt first, her movements careful and reverent as she placed her daisy at the base of Michael's headstone. The white petals seemed to glow against the dark marble. "I forgive you, brother," she whispered, her words meant for Michael, but carrying the weight of every hurt she'd learned to release. "And I forgive myself, too." Jack placed his daisy on Sarah's grave with the tenderness of a prayer, its petals touching the cool stone like a gentle kiss. His prayer was silent, but his face showed everything gratitude for what they'd shared, acceptance of what had been lost, and the quiet joy of a heart finally at peace with both past and future. The morning breeze stirred the flowers, making them dance together in the golden sunlight that now streamed freely between the oak branches. Grace and Jack stood shoulder to shoulder, their shadows merging on the grass behind them like two lives becoming one story. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 7 times, and they knew the workshop would be filling up soon with veterans and volunteers, all seeking their own version of healing. But this moment belonged to the 4 of them, 2 above ground, 2 below, connected by loss and love and the transformative power of forgiveness. "You know what Emily said yesterday?" Jack's voice was gentle, carrying the warmth of a father's pride. "She said she could feel Sarah smiling when we're all together at the workshop." Grace's eyes misted slightly, her heart swelling with affection for the remarkable girl who had become like a daughter to her. "That girl has wisdom beyond her years. She gets that from her mother." Jack smiled, his weathered hand finding Grace's and intertwining their fingers with natural ease. "Sarah always said everything happens for a reason, even the things that break our hearts into a million pieces." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the cemetery's old trees, painting the morning sky in shades of gold and pink. The daisies gleamed white against the dark stone, symbols of the pure, simple truth they discovered through pain and time. That healing comes in its own season, through unexpected channels, and that love multiplies rather than divides when shared. Grace squeezed Jack's hand, her voice soft but clear in the morning stillness. 2 lives lost gave birth to 100 redeemed. Jack's reply came with the warmth of deep understanding, his eyes reflecting the peace that had taken root in both their hearts. That's what grace does. The morning light streamed through the ancient trees, touching the daisies, the headstones, and the two people who had found their way through the wilderness of grief to something beautiful and lasting. They stood together, grateful for the past that had brought them here, and at peace with the present they had built from their brokenness. In the distance, Emily's laughter could be heard as she helped prepare the workshop for another day of healing, and Grace smiled, knowing that some endings are really just the beginning of something even more beautiful. The morning sun climbed higher over the renewal project's freshly painted walls, casting long shadows across the bustling parking lot. Cars with license plates from as far as California and Maine lined the gravel drive. A hand-carved wooden sign, its letters filled with gold paint, welcomed visitors. National Day of Healing and Hope. Jack Miller stood on the workshop's wide porch, his carpenter's hands resting on the smooth oak railing he'd crafted himself. The sight before him made his heart swell. Over 200 people milled around the grounds, sharing coffee from paper cups and trading stories in small groups. "I never imagined it would grow this big," Grace said softly, appearing at his side. She wore a simple blue dress, her usual business, attire set aside for something more approachable. Her hand found his on the railing, and their fingers intertwined naturally. "God's plans are always bigger than ours," Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion. Inside the workshop, volunteers arranged chairs in neat rows, while others set up displays showing before and after photos of furniture restored by veterans and former inmates. Each piece told a story of redemption, scratched tables made smooth again, broken chairs given new life. Emily, now 16, gathered a group of children near the entrance. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she carried a box filled with small garden trowels and daisy seedlings. "Okay, everyone," she called out, her voice clear and confident. "Today we're going to plant hope." The children crowded around her, eager faces turned upward. Some were from local families, others had traveled with their parents from across the country. Each child wore a name tag decorated with a hand-drawn daisy. "See these flowers?" Emily held up a seedling. "They're just like us. They need love and care to grow, but once they bloom, they make the whole world more beautiful." Jack watched his daughter with pride as she demonstrated how to dig the small holes along the workshop's entrance. She'd grown so much in the past year, carrying her mother's gentle spirit while developing her own strength. "She's a natural teacher," Grace observed, her eyes soft, "just like Sarah was." Jack nodded, grateful that he could now hear his late wife's name without that sharp stab of pain. "Sarah would have loved this," he said, "all these people coming together to heal." The morning proceeded with workshops and testimonials. A former Marine showed how woodworking had helped him cope with PTSD. A young woman spoke about finding purpose after prison through the skills she'd learned. Throughout it all, the sound of children's laughter drifted in from outside as Emily's planting project continued. Around noon, Jack led a session on forgiveness. He stood before the packed room, his words simple but powerful. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting," he explained. "It's about choosing to love anyway. It's about planting daisies on the very ground that once held only tears." Grace sat in the front row, her eyes never leaving his face. She'd come so far from the guarded woman who'd once confronted him at her brother's grave. Now she was the workshop's strongest advocate, using her influence to spread their message of hope across the country. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Emily's young gardeners proudly showed off their work. A ring of fresh planted daisies circled the workshop's entrance, each one representing a different story of healing. Some children had planted them for lost parents, others for sick siblings or friends. Each flower carried a prayer. "Look, Dad," Emily called out, her hands dirty but her face glowing. "We made a garden of second chances." The phrase caught on, and soon someone had brought out a piece of wood and paint. Together, the children created a new sign to hang beside the daisies. "Garden of Second Chances, where hope blooms again." As the event wound down and visitors began to leave, many stopped to share their stories with Jack and Grace. A widow from Texas wanted to start a similar program in her hometown. A prison chaplain from Oregon asked about their mentoring process. Each conversation ended with hugs and promises to stay in touch. The sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as the last cars pulled away. Emily sat on the porch steps, tired but happy, her head resting against Grace's shoulder. Jack went inside and found a small crystal vase, one of Sarah's favorites that he kept in his office. With careful movements, he filled it with water and placed a single, perfect daisy inside. The workshop was quiet now, filled with the kind of peace that comes after a day of good work. He set the vase on the windowsill, where the last rays of sunlight caught the crystal and scattered tiny rainbows across the floor. "For Sarah," he whispered, touching the soft petals. "For Michael, for every soul still healing." Grace and Emily joined him, their reflections appearing in the window beside his own. Three people brought together by loss, now bound by something stronger than grief. And the wind carried the scent of daisies across Willow Creek, a promise that love, once sown in forgiveness, never truly dies. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Jack Miller, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.